So it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. We have three. I'll just introduce the first one, Phil Parks, who's a reader in conservation at Cardiff University. And Phil will introduce the second colleague, who will then introduce the third colleague, and so on. So it's three that we have tonight, three speakers tonight. Phil has worked as an objects conservator for over 25 years, treating objects ranging from a fossilized mammoth's tooth through to a CD jukebox, carrying out collection surveys and offering collections care advice, providing analytical services and producing reports on the heritage sector that have impacted on government policy. He's also worked extensively with a lot of the objects that we have in the Egypt Centre collection, some of which will be presented on tonight. Since 2011, Phil has been teaching on the BSc and MSc conservation courses at Cardiff University, bringing this practical experience into the teaching. And I had a chance to visit Phil as well as the students on several occasions, bringing some students from Swansea down there. And it's really fantastic to see the work that they have been doing and really getting the students involved in the projects that they have there. So without further ado, I shall pass over to you, Phil.
Right, well, thank you very much for the introduction, Ken. And it's great to have the opportunity to talk to so many people about the work that we're doing at Cardiff University. As Ken said, tonight we're going to look primarily at the conservation of the coffin of Angkor, and then we're going to have Ashley bringing you up to date with some of the work that's currently being carried out as part of the Provisions for the Dead project in ancient Egypt. So, conservation at Cardiff. Conservation of objects is part of a wide range of archaeology and conservation degrees that we offer at Cardiff University. And the BSc Conservation of Museum Objects and the MSc Conservation Practice focus on the hands-on conservation of artefacts, with students working on a range of materials from museums, archaeological units, research institutions. And it's as part of these degrees that we've been carrying out conservation of objects belonging to the Egypt Centre. We've worked in the sector for so long, we have many contacts in heritage organisations throughout Wales and the wider UK to help us out with these objects. And our work with the Egypt Centre collection actually dates back to the late 1970s. It's something we've looked at as part of the project, actually sort of trying to document some of the old records. And at some point, I will actually get in touch with Ken to sort of do a nice little talk on some of those as well. You know, there's a lot of history of those objects there. So the coffin itself, well, following our work on the coffin that's currently on display at the Egypt Centre, we were asked to help with the conservation of coffin AB 118. And this presented an excellent learning opportunity for our students as part of the conservation degree schemes, so we agreed. The collaboration works in that our students gain practical experience of working on real museum objects, while the museum itself benefits from conservation and analysis that may be unlikely to be funded or be carried out otherwise. And this work can and has been carried out over a number of years. The work on this particular coffin is still ongoing over 20 years later. So what I'm going to talk about today is a summary of the various projects that have been carried out as part of the conservation of this coffin overall. So the coffin arrived in our labs on the 21st of July, 1998. It seems quite a while ago now, in what can only be described as a state of disrepair. Apologies for the lighting in these photos. These are actually scans of photographs taken in 1999, but they do help to show the condition of the coffin itself. There's sections of cartonnage that you can see lying in the base, which may or may not be associated with the coffin itself. And you can see the side of the base has become detached. There's many areas where textiles detached from the wood. It's loose, it's flapping around, gesso's cracking and falling away, and there's sort of lots of loose and flaking areas of paint. The whole surface is extremely dirty and dusty, and someone's written chambers in chalk on the lid. I don't know if you can also see, but the head section there there's actually a section of wood missing from the top of the head, and the textile there is just hanging over a gap. So the first thing that was done to it, one of our students, Jenny Gosling, was given the coffin to look at as part of a master's dissertation. And as part of that dissertation, she started looking at the history of the coffin and went on to study the pigments. So as looking at the history, she consulted with John Taylor from the British Museum and also dug out supporting information from a 1910 letter by P.D. Scott Moncrief, the British Museum. In terms of date, we're looking at late 25th or early 26th dynasty, and this is, the information that's come back from the British Museum. And this has been shown because the goddess Nut has 3 divisions on her wings, generally shown with 4 divisions after 660 BC. The locale, Thebes, similar in style to coffins produced there. And along with the standard prayers to the gods, the name Ankh-Pakerid is on the foot and sides of the coffin lid and inside the base. His mother's name, Taru, and father's Pediaset, is also named. So the name Ankh-Pakerid is on the foot and sides of the coffin, but it's not on the top. On the top of the coffin here, on the right-hand side, you can see areas of white that clearly stand out from the background, almost like the original text has been Tipp-X'd out. And this change stands out vividly now, but this might not have been as obvious when it was originally done. It's the aging and yellowing of the varnish over the years that's led to the overpainting becoming clearly visible. John Taylor from the British Museum informed Jenny that the prayer on the central line asked for the funeral offerings and a good burial for the priest, the stolist of Apu, the priest of Horus, lord of Suki, Jedor, deceased, son of priest of similar rank, Horsi Aset, deceased, born of the lady of the house, Abi, deceased. So we have evidence of reuse of the coffin. Why? It might be this was an accepted part of burial culture in times of austerity, or it could be that unscrupulous coffin suppliers were looking at ways to cut costs in terms of both materials and production times. So we have 2 owners of the coffin. The coffin did used to have a mummy in it, which was studied by the British Museum, I think in the 1960s, long before the empty coffin came to us. Interestingly, the body in the mummy was a female, so neither of the 2 named occupants. So in total, this coffin has had 3 occupants. It may be the final body to rest in it was one simply to add to the value of the coffin for sale or to add interest, rather than having been originally associated with it in any way. As I said, Jenny looked at, as well as the history, at carrying out a range of analytical and microchemical tests to identify the pigments. Light microscopy was used to examine cross sections, getting information on how the paints were layered and identifying colour, size and shape of particles. Chemical tests such as, oh sorry, I've not got my video on. There we go. Chemical tests such as does the pigment dissolve in acid was used to differentiate between azurite and Egyptian blue, and staining of varnish layers to test for proteins and oils. Scanning electron microscopy was used to determine elemental composition of pigments. For example, to determine whether the red colours were iron-based hematite, mercury-based vermilion, or red lead. Jenny also used X-ray diffraction, looking at crystal structure, to further aid identification of the minerals. So what are the results? As you can see, Jenny showed the blue pigment was Egyptian blue, the reds and yellows were iron-based pigments, and the black was a subtle charcoal-based carbon rather than bone black. So after this study of the history of the coffin, the analysis of pigments, you'd be forgiven for thinking that we were raring to get on with the conservation. For some reason, and I've been thinking back about this, I think what it was we actually got a large infrastructure grant in to redesign our labs at the time. And so as part of this, we had to pack away a lot of our objects for the work to be done. Unfortunately, the coffin stayed in storage for the next 10 years. And I'm going to fast forward now to 2009, when we decided to open the large box at the back of the stores again. In reality, we had students expressing an interest in Egyptian material. And as I mentioned earlier, we do aim to please by tailoring objects to students' work. Stephanie White was assigned the job of starting to work on the coffin lid, focusing on the face. So with the face itself, you can see There's a large amount of lifting textile and loose flakes in the photographs. There's also a large section of the wood missing from the top of the head, which I showed earlier. And the paint itself was very vulnerable due to the textile being loose and flapping around. It's difficult to tell from these photographs, but Stephanie realised the face was actually completely detached from the lid and simply resting in position. And so she took the decision to lift it off in order to allow for more thorough examination, cleaning and consolidation. Before doing this, Stephanie carefully dry cleaned the surface, followed by a solvent clean to remove the dust and dirt that had accumulated. Loose paint flakes and gesso were consolidated and re-adhered where possible. And then using a frame to carefully support the textile, the face was lifted away from the lid. So here we can see the face separated from the coffin lid itself, and this allowed access to the area beneath the face for repair work to be carried out, as well as to allow for some reshaping of the textile where it had become creased and folded. And you can see here the lid without the face on, and the missing piece of wood was replaced with a piece of balsa wood and a synthetic putty made of an acrylic resin with glass mic balloons and paper pulp to give it a bit of flexibility, not to make it as hard as a sort of modern epoxy resin or similar. The face was replaced on the lid, and over a period of several days, layers of the putty were applied to provide a shaped gap fill to support the textile and provide some shaping behind it. The textile itself, as I say, it had been sort of folded and creased, and so in some areas we had to relax it, and this was done using an ultrasonic humidity pencil. So it's producing a fine mist of moisture over the surface of the textile, relaxing that textile and allowing it to be flattened again. Stephanie also took the opportunity to remove the eyes, the copper alloy eyes, cleaning the corrosion that was forming beneath them and treating with a corrosion inhibitor and lacquer to slow down any further corrosion. So after the treatment here, you've got the textile and flaking pigment and gesso has been secured. The missing areas of wood have been replaced. The eyes are corrosion free, and everything's been realigned to present a far more stable object. So we haven't actually gone for any sort of in-painting as such. We've simply made good the damage that had been done to the textile and the wood itself. I mentioned the cartonnage in the base of the coffin, and around the same time this was lifted out and some work was done on that. So the cartonnage had suffered from being torn slightly, and the decision was made to repair the tear and to place it on a slightly curved support. Now, the student who did this, Kieran Lavelle, decided to go one step further. He thought that for display purposes, it should rest on a torso. And I'm not quite sure how he managed this. I mean, you know, it could be the gift of the gab. He's from Ireland and very, very persuasive. He managed to persuade the other students to wrap him in cling film and cover his chest in plaster bandage in order to construct an appropriate support. So, you know, this actually has ended up going back to the Egypt Centre as this, with a plaster model of Kieran's chest as the support for the object. Now, interestingly, the object has come back into the lab for further work under the AIM project that Ashley's going to talk about later. As following visits by Ken and the team from the Egypt Centre, when we got the base out again last year, Ken spotted that some of the fragments in the bottom of the base actually aligned with the missing areas on the cartonnage here. So hopefully we'll be able to fill in a few of the gaps that you can see in this final image. 2012, conservation of the foot. Again, another gap of a couple of years, but after having conserved the head of the coffin, we decided to move on to the foot. And this is Gemma McBader carrying out conservation work. Again, a clean and consolidation of the surface. And again, relaxing the textile that's creased and folded, reattaching it to the wooden support. And what you can see Gemma doing here is using a technique. She's using a Japanese tissue and a hydroxypropyl cellulose adhesive. And what she's done is she's soaked the tissue in that adhesive, let it dry, and she's slipping it behind the textile and reactivating it with a spray of ethanol. And the end result is very subtle. The textile is tacked down onto the wood, and you can see it all just looks neater. You wouldn't really know a conservator had been there. And in the end, that's often the way with good conservation. You can't tell a conservator's been there. But it's all been readhered. The colours are slightly brighter with it having been cleaned, and overall stability has been restored to what was quite a vulnerable area of loose textile and paint at the base of the coffin lid. Now, I like to think this is the time, so 2015, when I started to say, all right, I've had enough of this lid sitting in the labs, or as I sometimes like to say, okay, we'll get the ball rolling again on this. But we've looked at the outside of the lid for over 15 years. What was it like inside? Well, before we could really look inside, we had to make sure that the outside was secure, ready for turning over. And this part of the project involved securing all these sort of flaking areas and loose textile along the edges of the lid. So the foot and the face have been done, they're nice and solid, but we've still got all those sort of edges of the textile running along the side of the lid. And Susie and Sophie used a system of straws, plasterzote and sandboxes to add a bit of weight to apply gentle, even pressure to hold the textile flat against the surface as the adhesive cured. And as you can see, the end result is the textile is nicely tacked down onto the substrate there. Again, choice of adhesive is important so that it doesn't darken or stain the textile. They're stable and reversible, which is essential in conservation work. We didn't want to just lift and turn the lid. One thing we had noticed from putting a camera underneath and taking some shots of the inside was that there was a large split running down the center. And there was concerns that if we didn't have it properly braced, the warping and twisting as it moved could cause some serious damage. And so the lid was securely strapped up with a lightweight board of aluminium honeycomb as a rigid support. And the students bravely opted to document the whole event on camera. And we do have a film of the turning taking place. I've included a few clips here to show the number of people involved in doing this. The actual sort of weight of this when you're trying to turn it, it's quite impressive. So having turned it over, the next stage was some aesthetic work. So the work that Stephanie had done in terms of putting the gap fill in and the piece of wood under the head, obviously she was working from one side only. So once we turned it over, it was a case of tidying up what she'd done. The other students also decided, you can see on the left of the image, Stephanie had used a Japanese tissue again under the textile to tack it down, but this was quite visible as a sort of white layer peeking out from beneath the gaps. And so the students decided to sort of reactivate this, lift it away again, and reapply a toned Japanese tissue to make it less visible overall. And once we were able to turn over the lid properly, you can see the inside. Now, obviously this is slightly muted with dusty surfaces, but generally much, much cleaner than the top. So what we're looking at here, it just looks so bright and fresh. And when you think 2,500 years old, and it just looks absolutely beautiful. You can see that large crack running down the center, and this is why we're so nervous about actually turning it over, the structural stability of this. And there's also quite a large void at the foot area that also needed filling as well. So quite a bit of work still to go on here, much less in the way of cleaning, but much more in the way of structural stability on this. So with this one, a lot of the cleaning was able to be done with a low-powered museum vac and a brush, making sure, of course, that that we didn't sort of sweep up any sort of loose fragments there. And most of the major work on the inside, as I say, was much more gap filling along that crack. And for this, students carried out a number of tests and decided upon using a sort of Japanese tissue pulp. So again, the sort of Japanese tissue with the random fibers, it's got that strength. It's very strong material once it's in an adhesive. And the sort of adhesive they use as well, it's got a bit of flex to it. So the combination of the materials means it can take that little bit of movement that you get with the wood reacting to the general environment. The large section at the feet, again, was gap filled and covered over with a toned Japanese tissue. And the students took the opportunity to get lots of nice photographs of the inside, because obviously, you know, it's difficult to get the inside and the outside showing at the same time on display. So the after shots of the inside, it's brighter, although it wasn't hugely dirty anyway. The loose flakes are consolidated. It's more structurally stable due to those infilled areas, and all the loose textile is reattached. So 2018, flip the lid back over again. So again, strap the lid up. We're still being very careful, obviously. You know, although we've made it more stable, we still don't want to sort of put excess stresses on it where possible. So strapping it back up, flipping it back over, and some more paint consolidation in minor areas, but much of the work is on cleaning. As the paint has been consolidated, we're able to sort of clean it with a dry cleaning system. And after some tests, the students decided to go for a soft smoke sponge. And hopefully this will work. Some of you might have seen the lovely time-lapse video that Stephanie, who is the project manager for this stage, put up on Twitter. And what I particularly like about this is the satisfaction of seeing that pile of dirty pieces of smoke sponge gradually build up. So you can see she's starting with the clean pieces and then dirty pieces being replaced there. Just gives you a sense of how much dirt and dust she's bringing off this. The smoke sponge is vulcanized natural rubber, a varying grade of softness, ideal for cleaning dry soiling on sound surfaces, which is what this is now. It's being consolidated. Obviously, that was considerably sped up. It was a process of several days worth of careful cleaning to go over the whole surface. And the end result, 20 odd years on, we've got the lid finally stable. All of the loose textiles re-adhered, the missing bits of wood have been replaced, cracks supported with filler, fragile paint's been consolidated, and the surface has been cleaned, including the removal of the chalk text on the lid. There's probably small amounts of additional work that could be done, but we've decided the best approach is to move on to the conservation of the base and then to reintegrate everything at the end of the project when we know where we are. And I mean, again, I'd just like to thank the Egypt Centre for allowing our students to work on this. It's given so many students work over the years, a range of experiences from project management, team working, analysis of ancient pigments, techniques and materials, complex decision making. It's going to continue to do so as we proceed to work on the base. So 2019, we put the lid away in the store, not for another 20 years, hopefully, and got the base out to study. The reason the base is wrapped in plastic is, if you remember from the slides at the start, the side is actually falling off and the plastic is all that's holding it together. Now, I was the one who put that plastic strip on 20 years ago. And unfortunately, I forgot to mention this to Sarah, who's in the picture here, who was dealing with the base and who got the shock of her life when she started to take the plastic off for a nice photograph and the side just fell away from the coffin. It's probably just as well that I wasn't around in the lab at that time, apparently. To continue to talk about the work on the base in more detail, I'm going to hand over to Ellie Evans. Ellie is a second-year master's student on the Conservation Practice course, and she came to Cardiff asking if she could work on Egyptian material as she studied Egyptology at undergraduate level, and is now the project lead on this phase of the conservation. So over to Ellie.
Hi, so I'm going to be talking about the work that's been done on the Coffin base this academic year, so starting in October 2019. So I recruited 6 team members who are a mix of first year and second year MSc students and also 1 undergraduate student as well. So we have a nice kind of mix of different experience levels and different interests as well. So my first step working on the Coffin base was to do a visual inspection. And this allowed me to determine what conservation's treatment it was going to require. So I reviewed the lab records and the paperwork from previous students' conservation of the lid and the mask on the lid as well. And this gave me an insight into the needs that the lid had, which were very similar to the base. And after this, I began to plan treatment for the base over this academic year. So first, with my visual analysis, I looked into what materials it was made of. So we've got it being made of wood, and research into wood used for Egyptian coffins suggests that it was likely to have been made from tamarisk or sycamore, which were both native to ancient Egypt. And coffin mades from tamarisk or sycamore were made by fitting smaller pieces of wood together to create a box or an anthropoid coffin shape. And having looked at more detail in this coffin, there is lots of kind of smaller pieces under the base especially, so I definitely think this is the kind of one of those kind of woods that would have been used. The surface of the coffin shows the presence of gesso, as Phil also mentioned, and this is a plaster which is often used in ancient Egyptian times to prepare a surface like wood for decoration. Gesso usually refers to a gypsum plaster, but it's also extended to refer to a whiting plaster as well. And whiting plaster is made of a glue and limestone crushed into a powder. Gesso and whiting plaster were used to cover wooden surfaces in order to create a better surface for decoration. And decoration was added by adding cartonnage. And cartonnage is a material made from linen and gesso kind of mixed and layered together. So you can see in the middle picture, you've got this sort of layer that's decorated, and you can see that exposed linen under some flakier bits of gesso. So that's sort of that layer of decoration. And then there's pigments which were used to create paints which decorate the surface of the cartonnage. And there's also some sort of varnish on top as well. And I don't believe that's analysed. I think that was a question in the Q&A. I don't think there's analysis of that one. But I will move on to the next slide. So as Phil said as well, this coffin base is held together with plastic straps because the right-hand side has completely come away. And you can see two large cracks along the base, which one of them, it isn't a full break. The central crack isn't a full break, but the one along the right-hand side is where the side has just come away completely. And once we gathered the team together to take off all the straps and carefully lower the right-hand side, we got the team to feel the weight of that side. And we also got to see underneath a little bit where these little planks were moving around. So hopefully we'll be able to flip the base and see what's going on the underside. There's also a piece of decoration at the foot of the coffin. It's hard to see in this picture because of the straps, but it's a sun disk decoration that's actually from the lid. And I believe it's from where the piece of the lid was missing in the head area. So hopefully we can replace that when we sort of bring the whole project together at the end. There's also been lots of losses of gesso from the linen. So there's like areas where there's like exposed wood or pieces of linen that are loose or that are warped out of shape. Some areas of gesso inside and outside this coffin have cracked and come away as well. Humidity and higher temperature can cause gesso to deteriorate and crack and break away. The linen components of the coffin have also suffered from desiccation because they've become kind of warped and out of shape. So in order to reshape them, we could use a preservation pencil, which is like a cold mist to sort of reshape, kind of moisturize it and shape it back onto the sides of the coffin. So here's a photograph, just a better one, of the sun disk that's from the lid, but it's in the foot of the coffin base. And here's also some cartonnage pieces that Phil mentioned earlier from that object, which is now being conserved at Cardiff as well, that were found in the base. So I've removed those, let's probably say in October, I moved those and gave them to Ashley to be put back with the original object. So that's just nice. That's all come together. So the condition of the coffin, there are two broken wooden dowels at the head of the coffin on the side which has come away. And these appear to have snapped under the weight of the right-hand side of the coffin. Having held the side of the coffin with the team, I know that it is a very heavy piece of wood. So the foot plate of the coffin, which you can see on the right-hand picture, is also kind of completely detached. It just sort of sits in place. And there are two dowels, but they don't go sort of into the wood. They kind of are on the outside. You can see them on the picture. It sort of just sits on the dowels. I think the decoration and the cartonnage and gesso probably held that and plastered it into place originally. The wood of the coffin as well has also warped, so even sort of repairing the structure might be more difficult now because it's warped with humidity changes and things. So if we try to fix this side back on, it might not fit as snugly. I hope that made sense. But in view of its age, this wood has suffered less deterioration than might have been expected. I know from studying Egyptology that not a lot of wooden artifacts are found, and especially something like this, I mean, coffins is just, it's really brilliant to have something that's like in such a good condition, considering the amount of things it's come across the ocean. It's come to the UK, it's done remarkably well. There's also the possibility that the layers of cartonnage and gesso have kind of protected the wood as well. And also it's been stored in a kind of a dark place, so it's kind of been kept safe, and it's been kept at a pretty consistent temperature at the conservation lab, so it's definitely had 20 years of good TLC. So if we can see here the right and the left hand sides of the coffin, and the decoration on the right hand side, you can see is there's a lot less of it than the left hand side, and that's because the right hand side is physically detached and that decoration is sort of peeled away, and it looks, it's kind of both like deteriorated and flaked away, and it's also kind of bunched up a bit. I don't know if you can see under some of the straps, like, because the way we had to save this coffin, we had to just strap it together. So hopefully once we turn it over, we can sort of have a better look at that and try and re-adhere these and fit them back to the coffin surface and get more of that decoration back. On the visual inspection as well, the colours of the paints used on the cartonnage are quite bright and vibrant, and considering how old this object is, I think the colours have just lasted amazingly well. And as I said before, there is evidence of a varnish, but unsure of what it is, and I don't think it will affect the conservation treatment I've planned. It didn't seem to affect what was planned for the lid too much, so it should be all fine with just consolidation in the same way that we did on the lid. So the use and the meaning behind this coffin. So this coffin was used to house a mummified body of a person, first Ankh-Pared, then Jedhor, and then another person who was the female mummy that we found that someone found inside it. And I believe that mummy did go to London, and then it went, might have been Wadhurst. Ken can clear that one up, and then I think it went to Manchester as well. Can't remember the order, but I know Ken definitely knows that. Once the conservation work is completed on this, it will go back to the Egypt Centre and hopefully go on display. We've had a few discussions on how it will go on display, what position. And this coffin style is typical of the 25th, 26th dynasties. And it has hieroglyphs on the inside and the outside, which are sort of funerary texts, and they're used to sort of feed the car spirit of the deceased. And the car spirit is like the soul of the deceased, for those who don't know. And that requires sustenance, and the sustenance comes from reading out these texts. So sort of like the verbal speaking of the words feeds the soul. It can be determined that this coffin belonged originally to a man, not only from the names on it, but also because of the colour of the face. The red colour shows that it was a male, whereas female faces would usually be painted pink or yellow. Down the centre of the base of the coffin, I should also mention, there is a large jed pillar painted on it, and that is a symbol of sort of, is a symbol linked with Osiris, and it symbolises stability as well. That's my words. And it's also known as Osiris's backbone as well, and the way it was painted, it's sort of where the deceased person's backbone would lie on top of, so it's sort of like linking them to Osiris and stability, and yes, that's what. There's also an image of the sun disk with the uraeus and some like wavy horns. The sun disk links the deceased to sort of the sun's journey, and the uraeus is sort of like used in kind of god, sort of like deity insignia, and also kings and queens as well tend to have those pictured on like temple walls, and they do see uraeus on their crowns. And the wavy horns, I believe, linked to the ram-headed god Khnum, but I couldn't find a lot of information on why it was on a jed pillar, but hopefully someone else might know that. So moving on to what we needed to do. The first thing was to get a photographic record of the coffin, and we found it quite tricky to work out how to get the full length picture of the coffin, so I thought, right, okay, let's get a picture of it in sections and then try and stitch them together in Photoshop. And as you can see in the bottom picture, it didn't really work out that well. However, it was a useful task to do because we got pictures of the coffin surface without the plastic strap in the way, so we got to see the before condition kind of uncovered by the straps. So it wasn't all kind of like a waste of time, but I did want to get a full length photo. So I went and I spoke to previous project manager Stephanie Whitehead, who kind of gave me some hints and tips. And I also spoke to Mark Lodwick from Archaeological Photography at Cardiff University, and he gave me some tips. and I managed to get a full-length photograph. So it did have the straps on, so I've now got the benefit of having more kind of up-close pictures of the sections and then a full-length picture with the straps on to show the condition before. And we also got to get pictures of the head and the foot ends and each side, which we've seen in my previous slides. So that was really kind of useful step, and it was really sort of satisfying, and it allowed me to move on and start actually treating the coffin. So our first step was to clean the surface of the coffin base. And what we used was a museum vacuum with gauze over the nozzle, sorry, soft brushes, and also vacuum tweezers on the more kind of delicate areas where the vacuum could have sort of like caused too much damage on the sort of, there's areas where the linen is a bit soft or like kind of crumpled, and it was just, I didn't want to risk causing any damage with the vacuum. So I used vacuum tweezers, which are on the left. They're like a tiny device, literally a tiny vacuum, but it's got a kind of end that picks things up and you drop them down. I like tweezers. So that was a really kind of useful experience to kind of get a feel of what the coffin surface is. And it also did bring out the colours so much. When we removed all this dust from the coffin, it just came out and was really bright and vibrant. And I should say, when we put the gauze over the nozzle, it was to sort of remove the flakes of loose gesso, but we did keep them aside. So should they be needed, or should they find a place which they actually know they came from, we've got those as well with the object. We've not just sort of disposed of them. And so here's an image of before and after we did the surface clean. I don't have a lot more images because coronavirus stopped me going into the lab. So this is probably one of the best before and afters I have. Hopefully you can see the difference. I definitely can, but it's just very satisfying getting rid of all of those bits out of it and seeing the colours like pop out. So that's the kind of results of the cleaning of the surface. The next stage we wanted to go on to was repairing the structure of the coffin. So this was the right hand side that had fallen off. We wanted to fix it back in place, and we had different kind of options that we discussed. So one thing was building a sort of support structure. There's like a rib cage around it, and that was one option, but it kind of proved to be a bit too difficult for our expertise and lab resources. So another option was to just re-dowel the coffin. So remove the broken dowels, put some new dowels in, add some adhesive, and like really make a really good, strong physical join. So that's what we wanted to do. But alas, the labs were closed in March. I think it was the 16th or 17th of March. So we had to kind of stop in our tracks. Everything's just completely stopped. So we had thankfully finished our first step, which was the surface clean. So that was kind of nice that we had sort of got the ball rolling, as Bill said earlier. We've kind of got the project moving along. We've got plans for where it wants to go, but the project did stop. We couldn't redowel it. We couldn't reconsolidate the pieces of loose linen. So it's a really big shame. I feel really sad about this, but what can we do? But we did have a meeting online with Dr. Ken Griffin in March. We were meant to have it in person, but we had it on Zoom. And we discussed sort of the different ideas behind displaying the coffin when it goes to the Egypt Centre. And sort of, it would be, in an ideal world, we'd like to have it stood up, but with the condition of the coffin, it's probably not possible. So we're kind of sharing ideas of what other museums have done, whether we should display it and have like mirrors underneath so you can see inside. We had long discussions about this, and I think it's just going to be, let's see what happens when it's completely conserved and see how strong it feels, and then we can sort of have discussions then. That picture of the strange drawing is the kind of rib cage design. It was my kind of first sketch of it, but we didn't decide to go with that one as well because it's sort of quite visually a bit in your face. So the dowels would just be hidden inside the coffin, you wouldn't even see them. So that's why that's there, in case anyone was wondering. So yes, the next steps for next year's group, hopefully, will be to remove the broken dowels and replace them, consolidate the loose areas of linen and cartonnage that are coming away from the coffin surface, and then turning over the coffin for next year's team so they can have a look at what is going on kind of on the underside, because I don't think anyone really properly knows what's going on under there. So I will now pass on to Ashley Lingle, who has been an archaeological conservator for the last decade, and she completed her PhD at Cardiff University last year, where she's currently teaching on the conservation programme. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ali, and hello to everyone. Oops, hello. Way to start. I'm excited to be speaking to you all today. I'm going to talk to you briefly about the conservation work that I've undertaken for the Provisions of the Dead in Ancient Egypt project. It's funded by the Association of Independent Museums and the Pilgrim Trust. The project is part of this great collaboration that we have with the Egypt Center and Cardiff University Conservation. I've been fortunate to be the project conservator for this wonderful group of objects, which includes painted plaster, stone, ceramic, and cartonnage. Additionally, there are a number of painted wooden figures that are awaiting limb reattachments. Unfortunately, due to COVID, the project has been delayed, so I'll only be discussing the projects I was able to make a start on, which includes this large ceramic vessel in the center of the slide and these two painted plaster panels. Starting with the large vessel W193 from Armana. It's a red earthenware vessel. It has decorative bands of leaves and fruits, which are in blue and black and red. The vessel measures just over 70 centimeters in height and 44 centimeters in circumference at its widest point, so it's quite a large vessel. It was previously conserved in the 1970s, but there's no existing conservation records to indicate what interventions were undertaken. So, and the vessel was stored near a window for many years, which has created some interesting deterioration patterns. So while on one side it's well preserved, on the other side it's badly damaged. Phil had previously assessed this vessel and noted these strange deterioration patterns, and as part of this project we had the opportunity to do a bit of analytical work to really understand what was happening. When investigating the surface of the object, there are two things that really stand out in terms of deterioration. There's these small white crystals that you can see in the slide, and then also these waxy looking flakes on the surface. The small white crystals are an indication of soluble salts. Soluble salts are common with archaeological materials, and they can enter an object at sort of almost any point in its lifetime. Activities such as use, deposition, so when it's buried and the surrounding soil has soluble salts, or post-excavation contamination are all common ways that salts get into objects. Once they're excavated, fluctuations in microclimate, specifically changes in humidity levels surrounding the objects, can repeatedly cause the salts to dissolve and recrystallize. As the salts recrystallize, the pressure then breaks apart the object, so in this case the ceramic body, which creates the small pits that you can see across the surface. The waxy looking flakes, however, were more of a mystery. So we took some small samples for Thorium Transferred Infrared Analysis, FTIR, back at Cardiff University. FTIR works by emitting an infrared beam onto material. This causes the molecular structures and their bonds to vibrate in specific wavelengths, which produces a spectrum that much like on the screen. FTIR is really incredibly useful in conservation to help us identify a whole range of materials, in this case polymers used for consolidation. The drawback is that using it in this context of heritage materials, it's really designed for single material analysis, so looking for one thing at a time. But in this case, we had sort of a composite of both the ceramic body and the polymer. So what I needed to do was then work with the spectra that I got and figure out which peaks and bonds related to the ceramic body and what related to the consolidant. Ultimately, I was able to determine that the vessel was consolidated with a material called BIVA 317, which is a mixture of polymers, resin, and paraffin. And it also is known for its kind of waxy finish. So all the pieces kind of fit together. Now that we knew what we were dealing with, it was time to make a plan for this vessel and how it was going to be treated. The pot was actively deteriorated, so something needed to be done. It wasn't a case where we could just kind of brush it off and put it back. So after discussing the best course of action, eventually Phil, Ken, and I agreed that it needed a fairly high level of intervention. We needed to desalinate it to remove the salts, and any existing polymers needed to be removed, and eventually we needed to reconstruct the vessel. As a precautionary measure, the decorative surfaces were first covered in another waxy substance called cyclododecane. Cyclododecane is a solid that slowly sublimates, so it goes from a solid to a gas at room temperature. So following this, the vessel was deassembled and taken to Cardiff University to begin the desalination process. And you can see in the video there briefly that that was me starting sort of this disassembly process. So once the pot was apart, the sherds were placed in a large bath and soaked for 8 weeks. Somewhat fortuitously, they were ready to be removed at this point, which was the same point we had to pack up the lab in preparation for shutdown due to COVID. The sherds are now dry, and once I can get back into the lab, I will be able to remove the remaining adhesives and begin the reconstruction process, at which point the cyclododecane should have sublimated away. The two other projects I had a chance to begin work on are these two painted plaster panels, W1378 and W1377. Though the panels had been in protective frames, they were in need of some conservation TLC to help stabilize them. As the panels had both been treated before and again were without records, I needed to do some more analytical work before I could start the treatment. In this case, I started with ultraviolet light. When some objects are exposed to ultraviolet radiation, some of the materials, so things like adhesive pigments, etc., can fluoresce. They give off a visible light in varying colors, and these colors can help conservators narrow down the types of materials present, or indicate, with the case of W1378, multiple materials. As you can see, there's a few different colors there. So again, with the female figure, around the edges particularly, and then the center cracks of the objects, having that information to then specifically take samples from those areas to analyze and perform localized spot testing to decide how to best remove the failing adhesive was incredibly helpful. With the male figure, W1377, you can just see there's a very white, bright fluorescence. So presumably a single material. In this case, FTIR analysis was used again, and it confirmed it was a commercial beeswax as opposed to a natural beeswax, which might indicate that it was originally part of the object. But knowing that the wax was not original to the panel, Olin allowed me to remove it in places where it was obscuring the image, so particularly his hand. Unfortunately, however, I wasn't able to get much further with either of these projects due to COVID. But I'm greatly looking forward to getting back to the lab and continuing work on these wonderful objects and all the others that are part of this project. So thank you for indulging me, and thank you everyone for listening, and also all the students who have participated in the projects with the Egypt Center over the years. So thank you.